Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait a few more moments before we start as people trickle in. So, welcome to the Daniels Faculty Lecture, Methodic Optimism, given by Fala Atelier, and my name's Miska. And over this past semester, along with Rahul and Alexia, we've had the pleasure of being their students, and we're elated to be collectively hosting today's event. And as we begin today's event, and as we continue to find ourselves simultaneously together and apart, it's important to take a moment to reflect on our diverse geographies. I'm speaking to you from the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The University of Toronto also wishes to acknowledge this same land, the land on which it is situated. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on, to learn on, and to continue to learn about this land. We'd like to invite you to take a few moments or to take a moment to learn about the Indigenous as well as the other histories of the land you are currently joining from. And then for a few notes on the format of today's event, it is being live streamed and recorded. And if you do not wish to be captured, please turn off your camera. We ask you keep yourself muted throughout the presentation, and for questions, use the Q&A function, which is just located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you prefer to ask a question directly, just write your name with a little note indicating you'd like to ask your question on camera. And Rahul and Alexia will actually be addressing the questions at the end of the lecture. And now, let me introduce our guests. So Filipe, Ana Luisa, and Ahmed of Fala Atelier. And Fala is an architecture practice based in Porto and founded in 2013. The Atelier is, and to borrow their words, hedonistic, well-restrained, taking lightness and joy very seriously. And in addition to their well-known style of representation and their celebration of residential spaces, Fala has amassed a laundry list of accolades. They have received awards, their work has been widely published and exhibited, and they have taught and continue to teach in schools of architecture across Europe and while here at the University of Toronto. They have also lectured across Europe and North America, which is of course why we find ourselves here today. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Filipe, Ana Luisa, and Ahmed for their lecture, Methodic Optimism.
Thank you for the presentation.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. To perhaps, I would start by mentioning that so Fala is not just the three of us. We are a few people working together, almost a dozen, and we are actually right now in Portugal in this room that you see now on the screen, and this is where we work. I mean, it's a very simple setting, and perhaps I mean, we do a lot of different types of projects. We're not going to explain everything that the office does today. We're going to try to focus on some aspects of our work that relate also coincidentally with the teaching we are involved in at the University of Toronto these days, which have been a very, let's say, instructing experience for all of us. And so this is what happened last semester. At the end of last semester, this was the end of our first semester of research, it's called, of the studio we called The Usual Suspects. And unfortunately, we have not been able to see these posters ourselves on the campus of the university, but the students have thought it was very important to put some of the posters there. I'm just going to explain in a few words what this has been about and how it relates to what we do. Let's say the whole studio was starting from, let's say, one of the realms of architecture that fascinate us a lot, around domestic spaces in Japan. And there was an entire phenomenon with starting from the 60s all the way until the early 90s that we looked at. And it all starts from a certain moment when one architect, Kazuo Shinohara, in the 60s claims that the house is a work of art. But what interests us here is the diversity that stemmed from this. And we, with the students, looked at many of the hundreds of houses that were produced at that time and tried to wonder, let's say, what they meant, why they were so important to the scene that existed there. So it goes from houses that for some reason looked like faces, or perhaps less obvious faces, to houses that had grids of windows that are very difficult to explain on a rational level, but also houses that look like ziggurats, or houses that look like concrete, seemingly careless boxes, but that conceal, let's say, very abstract, opposed interiors, to houses that are doing exactly the opposite. So here, for example, a concrete box that is covered in reflective paint, while the interior, on the other hand, looks, one could say, urban. And I mean, so all of these houses are enigmas to a certain extent. We were wondering, for instance, why this architect decided to place windows where you would normally have a beam within this metal structure. Beam that window that subsequently becomes the favorite place for the cat to sleep here. But this was not just a one-off experiment. For instance, it seemed to be interesting enough to be carried in other houses, becoming these rays of light within a domestic space, but also other kinds of challenging windows. Windows that behave on their own, or at least seem to, but also openings that seem to be totally absurd or surreal, like this door that leads to probably the most useless balcony ever built. And also, let's say, other kinds of challenging spaces. Here, a bedroom that has a circular plan for some reason. Here, a living room that looks very much like the Pantheon, because it is under a conic space. We were also wondering why, for example, this roof would be curved where nothing, let's say, seems to push for that, but also why some architects would try to reduce the house to the shape of a roof so that the house becomes essentially a triangle like this one, or sometimes why that triangle becomes, let's say, a very totemic important element. Windows in this case that seem to come from the structure, but sometimes they do not seem to come from a structure. And sometimes one wonder if the shape of the roof comes from the triangular window, or vice versa. Or sometimes the roof that is very often a symbol of the house here is challenged and becomes one element within the composition on the same level as the windows or the structure. And why wouldn't a house be a cylinder, for example, or another kind of cylinder with a perfectly circular section, let's say, evoking the Pantheon in another way? Or why wouldn't a house look like a cloud? Or why wouldn't structure feel like trees within a forest? Or why wouldn't you actually have a tree in your living room? Or the structure that feels like a jungle could also clash in some cases with the very domestic elements of the house. And when all these things come together, you have houses that are really enigmas. This is one of, let's say, the things we try to unravel. In some cases, the symbolism is much more overt and clear. Here, the structure becomes a totem in the middle of a living room, defining its architectural ambition. In other cases, structure is really seems like a desired problem. Here, a column in front of the entrance door and in front of the main window of the space. And sometimes it's just the way the space is shown to us that is also an enigma. Here we have rabbits in the living room for some reason, and one of the openings in the wall is shaped like a heart for some reason. We were also wondering about the individual trajectories, why some architects would do houses that look like bunker, in order to, a few years later, build houses that are as light as possible right next to them. In this case, it's famously Toyoito that we see here in his own house, and that went all the way to get a Pritzker. But of course, these individual trajectories are less important to us than the diversity within all these houses, whether in one career or as a group of the entire, let's say, compendium we were looking at. And this diversity, we felt, was a promise. Like, how and why would architects devote themselves to that? This is one of the things we, let's say, try to answer also within our practice.
So as Ahmed was saying, this fascination for houses didn't happen now. It's something that has been stuck with us for a very long time, and we always use these references to our own projects, of course. And now we learn even more examples. So today we will show you a few houses. And this was actually the first house we finished. It was not our first project, but it was the first single-family house that we finished in an area that didn't matter at all, with a very terrible background and neighbors, or not terrible, but uninteresting. And we were forced to keep the volume, for example. And even in this not so interesting context, we always try to bring as much references as possible, to try to bring some dignity into these unknown places. So this is a very simple project. The original house was full of interior partitions, most of them without any natural light. We basically demolished everything, created a big open space for the living room, and then having facing the street and facing the back of a curb all the technical spaces needed. So with a very simple gesture, we were also forced to keep the existing volumetric shape of the outside. We created one simple and continuous space with a roof and with facades. And because for us we couldn't touch the side facades for regulations, we played with the front facade by having a typical door, a typical window, and the back facade completely open to the huge garden that we had. So the budget was extremely low, but we had this amazing garden that we wanted to also bring importance into the project. So here you can see some pictures of the project being done in several phases. The space becoming whitening, the entrance door marking with a strong color the entrance to this new world, and the blue door that was a normal garage door, but with a strong color that usually you wouldn't see in the surroundings. And then when you enter this space, you actually enter into a completely white space with a white epoxy reflecting as much light as possible to the interior of the space. And from the images which I showed before, you could see that it had a lower area next to the windows and a taller area closer to the center. But when you enter, your eyes look directly into the light, so directly into the lowest point of the space. And in here, we wanted to emphasize how tall this space is. But at the same time, when we make everything white, we blurred the edges, so it's almost impossible to fully perceive the actual size of the space. So we added one column, non-structural column, right in front of the entrance door, that is on your way, that as soon as you enter, you're forced almost to look up until you see where it ends. and that helps bringing back the huge scale of this space that at first impression might feel much smaller. And then it's a white canvas, the perfect white canvas for life to happen and for any kind of furniture, any kind of way of living to come and inhabit. The only elements that are present are the 4 doors that lead to each one a different program: entrance, bedroom, mezzanine that leads to that circle on top, and bathroom, and the column that shows the highest point of the house. And you can see that it's at least twice the size of the doors, and the doors, when you're next to them, they are not the typical size of a door, they are actually even taller. So everything helps emphasizing these different topics. And of course, it's impossible not to relate references and from our heroes and some of the projects that our students also studied before, and the composition of these different elements and the relation with the white canvas in the back. And sometimes it's not about proportions, sometimes it's just about what an element emphasizes in a certain project. And here you can see the lowest area as almost as a screen to the interior space. In this drawing, we show basically everything. It's the big white canvas space, the roof, and the side facades that are the most important. Then this house is actually the first house the first single family house we designed. That is not finished yet. It's one of those that it's being postponed. It's almost finished for the past 3 years, but it's a house that we completely. If we could change it now, we wouldn't change it at all. And sometimes there are projects that we would fix a few things, but in this case, it was one project that it was based a lot also in references. And again, here Shinohara talking about the column and the central column, or the column that feels central but it's not central, and the main space of the house, or the meaning space or the living space, or that is not just circulation, but it's also the most important space, or a central space that connects all the private areas from a house, even though from the outside might feel like a very banal concrete box. So this is actually our concrete box. And from the outside, you don't really perceive what's happening on the inside. From far, it's in a village that, again, not a very interesting village in the suburbs of Porto.
It's Anna's hometown. She comes from this village. It's important to know.
It's true, but it's not the most beautiful one. Like we have to be critical about our roots too. And the clients actually asked for a very modern house that they didn't want it to look like a house. But in the end, I think it still fits quite well in its context. It's not trying to relate, but it works together with the surroundings. So actually, it's a perfect square facing north, south, east, west, each corner. Completely trying to be detached from the neighbors. It's almost parallel to the street, but it's north-south, so it's not parallel to the street. And all the gestures were in the beginning actually to ignore the surroundings. And the clients asked for three bedrooms, each one of them with private bathrooms, so one for each generations. That's why this house, we call it the house for 3 generations. So grandparents, parents, and the daughter. And in this house, we decided to give each corner to one different private space. And actually the leftovers, it's what creates the common areas and what creates the living and the meaning space and where the common life of the house happens. And the shape of it is just a direct reflection of these very geometrical shapes that the bedrooms have. But actually, both inside the bedrooms and on when you're in the living, you don't really perceive these shapes as shapes, as a triangle, square, half, quarter of circle. So the interiors are quite simple. Bedrooms, bathrooms, a few technical areas. And each shape actually helps creating or guiding people in the space. So you enter next to the curve, and that guides you to the living room. Then the triangular shape opens actually a bigger space for the kitchen that the clients wanted to be a bit separate from the living room, but at the same time completely open to the living room. And it has a separate exit to the outside too. So all these elements are related. And when the clients asked us to also divide the kitchen from the living room, we ended up doing the smallest division possible between the two spaces, that is, or the smallest wall, that is a column. And this column, actually, it's not structural. It's not in the center of the house. It feels that it's in the center of the house, but it's not. Even though the pavements rotate around it, it's still just an architectural element that doesn't really divide physically the space, but at the same time, it completely divides physically the space. And from the inside, it's a very normal flat ceiling with the technical areas above. Each curve, each shape only has one colorful door. And this is some of the collages that we had, and the common areas rotate around this space. So these were the original collages that we did at the time. In the meantime, the kitchen changed color, a few things changed, but the main idea of the project didn't change. So here is the space. And again, this column, because it was not structural, actually there's a structural column hidden inside the walls. This one is just an architectural moment. Doesn't touch the ceiling, so you can see a bit the shadow on top. And that's that emphasizes the fact that we decided that we wanted to have that column there, not the engineer, not the technical reason. We as architects, we decided that it was needed to prove a point and to help dividing these several areas. And again, from the outside, just a very simple box. All the facades are the same except the living room that is special. All bedrooms have a square window, all bathrooms have a round window. The living room has a corner window. And this is the collage. So here you can see all the facades, and then the two entrance doors, the main one and the access also from the kitchen. So it's the most simple project, but with a very strong statement.
So, and this is a house that is radically different. This is the most recent project, or let's say it's not the one that was finished the most recently, but it is the most recent design proposal. And it is a small house with a monumental shower. It's a very tiny house. It's next to a supermarket in a corner of an interesting but forgotten property in a suburban town from Porto. It's an old construction of about 30 square meters, 15 on each floor. I'm sorry, I used the metric system. And it's a house that wants to be more than what it is. It's a house that was just meant to house the son of our client because he wanted to move out, but at the same time stay within the boundaries of the property. And the budget was so low that there was very little one could do other than renovating the shack where they used to store the wine bottles. And that did not stop us from looking again to higher references, so references that had a quite different ambition from the brief itself. So the brief was mundane, but I think that architecture does not need to be mundane, even when the brief is so. And we spent many days trying to understand how to play with this ambition and what we could do with it. And what was interesting to us was that the house itself was pretty much defined on its own. So it had 2 rooms. So below, we accepted that there would be a public space, above a private space. And this kind of archaic division or archaic naming of spaces, the bedroom and the living room, is how it ended up being used, but we do not see it forcefully like that. These are 2 rooms, and these rooms are open to speculation, let's say. And in the back, there's a very small technical space that fits the fireplace, the kitchen, and the bathroom. And when you look at the building from the outside, there's very little one could do about it, but at the same time, there's a certain romantic appeal to it. There's the granite, there's the small proportion of the openings, there's the romantic garden also, there's something going on. So what we decided to do was to extend only the few square meters we needed to, but doing annexes is always a dangerous game. Either they are proud enough to become projects of their own, or they become just mistakes in a project. So bad mistakes, not the good ones. And as such, in this case, we decided to celebrate that annex. So the annex becomes the project in a way. If the house gave all the clues, we needed to pretty much clad it on the inside, because that's as much as we did. The annex was the complete opposite. And this annex was actually just a shower, a very, very tall shower with a zenithal skylight at the top. So it becomes, well, what you could call the most monumental shower we ever designed so far. We are working on it. So from the outside, it's a very brutal construction. You can see the red box in the back, that is the supermarket, the granite original structure, and this gray chimney that shows up on the side. The metal roof is so light and so small that you can bring it in a truck and just put it in place, which is quite fascinating. And then on the inside, it's just, so this is not the project, this is a reference. It's just ambitious space, let's say. So it's an ambition that takes the shape of the possible space in this case. So you can see a lot going on. There's a concrete slab, there are granite walls that were pre-existing, there's a brick wall that was added to separate the technical areas, there's a wood beam that in the end was not even necessary because the metal roof was so strong it did not even need a wood beam. But in the end, all of this disappears on the inside. What remains is just the void, the volume, the room itself, and the beam. That is actually the only mistake the space needs in the sense necessary beam, even if in this case it was not on purpose. And we decided to paint the windows in the same color, or in a very similar color to the color of the windows of the house of the father that is just a few meters away. And once we started painting this column, all of those tests and the references we were showing before, they showed up again, and we tried to understand color as a material, as let's say as an expression, and not just the color but also the glossiness. And color over a texture like concrete is very different from color in abstract terms. So there was an opportunity to study something, and this kind of one-to-one mock-ups, let's say, on site were quite funny to see and to do. And let's say that this could be the project. The project could be maybe just that small annex. Sorry. And this is how the texture looks like in the end. So from very close, you can almost understand how the concrete and the cladding that is done with old wood relates to this plastic almost game of colors. And while you navigate around the romantic garden, you have these different perspectives that always give you in the background the red supermarket that I find to be almost fundamental for the success of the whole composition. And on the top of the shower, there's a small rock that was taken from the demolitions and added a bit as a reminder of something that we are not quite sure of what it is. And only when taking this photo, we noticed that there's an interesting resemblance between our annex and the electrical tower behind it that has a very similar pattern. And we swear we had no idea about it. So it was just a coincidence.
Subconscious.
Yeah, subconscious coincidence. And as you navigate around the house, at some point, the shower is not as important anymore because you have the wines and all of that going around. And then at some point, it's not even there anymore. So it's just a small house with funny colored windows with a double pitched roof for technical and architectural reasons. And once you go inside, as we said before, just 2 rooms. one below that has, let's say, social functions, and one above that has private functions. And the private space has a wide ceiling, and it takes advantage of the slopes of the pitched roof, and it relates mostly to the height of the wine, so you can almost touch the grapes in the morning, which is quite funny. And as you walk around it on the corner, there's a small door that takes you to the bathroom, and while in the bathroom there's a shower that allows you to look up to this kind of mini pantheon that is your shower, and you can see how the weather is going to be, and you can choose what you're going to dress while you're taking a shower, because you know exactly how the weather looks like that day. And when you go down, you have just a very small set of services, so a fireplace, a small kitchen with movable cabinets, and a spiral staircase that gives you the social space of the house, the living room. And this one is actually a bit sunken in relation to the garden, so you end up relating to the floor of that patio. So let's say that scale has a lot to do with this project, both on the annex, but also on the relation between the more human functions of the house with the outside spaces as well. And it provides this kind of moment where, since the space is so small, all the spaces are necessary, even to do some storage under the staircase, to put a sofa against the table that is facing the kitchen. So everything is very compact, and we actually find that quite beautiful in the end. And this is how the project stands. All the interior spaces, they are just standing on top of that small rock that is standing on top of that proud annex. And 079 is the house we finished the most recently. We call it the suspended house because it has something suspended on it. And it exists in a very banal neighborhood, in a city center of Porto, in a very, what we could call, discrete context again. So one of the things that is, let's say, a common denominator in most of our projects is the fact that they exist in the least spectacular context possible, which I believe became an added value to them. So they belong to banality. They are not the rich house in the middle of the desert that has all of those facilities. Yeah, you know the house I'm talking about. It is actually just another pixel of the urban landscape, but a proud pixel again. And this idea of pride is quite important for us, this idea of having what we could call the possibility of belonging while still, let's say, having a personality. And on the outside, it's very banal because it's just 2 levels, although the context has buildings of 3 levels, 4 levels, 5 levels. It's surrounded by buildings that some of them were not even built yet. Some of them are just ruins from the late 19th century. So there's a very interesting relation to its context. But what is really funny about it is that on the street side it has 2 levels, but on the garden side it has 3 levels because the street is actually 3 meters above the level of the garden. So from the street side it does not, let's say, you cannot guess what is going on the back. The 3 levels. So you, on this slide, you should imagine that you are accessing in the middle level. So you're accessing on the plan in the center. And the plan in the center and the plan above, on the level above, are exactly the same. They just have the same rooms and the same, let's say, relation between rooms. And on the level below, that is the level facing the garden, there's a completely open plan that relates to the outside. So when one divides the program, one could say that you have the traditional division, the bedrooms or the private spaces above, and the public space on the ground floor. Although it's important to say that this idea of designing houses as houses is not as appealing to us as it is this idea of designing a house as an architectural device. So if these rooms are bedrooms or living rooms or art galleries, or if they are just ruins in a few years, that's the same in our eyes. What is really relevant is the relation and the system they create between them. And this is just a set of rules and geometrical principles that help us define this plan. So the rooms, they are defined by a series of regulations because we have to follow the volume, we need to keep the alignments. We only have windows on the 2 short sides for practical reasons and regulations. So the size of the rooms is defined by the minimum size of a stair and the minimum size of a circulation. The room on the right is just a bit narrower because it's the minimum size for a bathroom, so that you have the maximum amount of area for the bedrooms themselves. So in the end, there's a series of constraints that lead to a mistake, a small glitch of 20 centimeters difference between two walls. And that glitch is celebrated profoundly in the central element that you see in black on this plan. And that element is just a column, but it's not a structural column. It's a column that sustains the project. It's supporting the whole narrative of the project, although it's not supporting any concrete element at all. It's a column that helps dividing the 4 spaces above, or the 8 spaces, the 4 in each level, and that gives meaning to the social space that happens below them. It's a column that disappears when you look outside, but appears when you look inside. And it's a column that you don't remember to think about while in your bedroom, but you are remembered of it every time you cross to the other bedroom, to the circulation space, to the bathroom, etc. So it's a column that tends to appear once in a while. So let's say it's like a column that is inhabiting the house already. So is it when you move into this house, there's already someone living in it, and you are remembered of this presence every time you navigate through it, every time you connect between 2 rooms, every time you circulate. So it's a column that is there, but it's not there. It's a column that is in the center, although not being the center. So it's a lot of columns at the same time. And it's a column that is simultaneously plastic, that has an appeal in terms of its expression, but also it's a column that is surrealist in a sense that it's never a column while being always a column. And it's many, many, many things at the same time again. So this is how it operates. So you can understand the alignments of the walls we had to fulfill. And all of these walls, they end on a door. All the doors are the same. The doors are floor to ceiling, which means that when they are open, the column reveals itself. And when they are closed, the column disappears and becomes just a small corner, a weird corner of a room. But most of the times the doors are in weird positions and you have different glimpses of what that column could be. And what is interesting is this, is that, as I was saying before, when all the doors are open, the column reveals itself. When all the doors are closed, the column becomes just a strange concrete corner. This is the extrusion of the column, again, the same game, and the floor is just an endless carpet of, let's say, a chessboard game with marble pieces of different tones that helps liberating this game between the doors and the column and so on. So this is how you perceive it on the levels above. And it's really funny because between these 2 images, you can understand, well, how much privacy you can or not get from the relation with this element, a fully open system and almost completely closed system. And the shape of the column is defined by the 4 doors, of course, and also by 4 exceptions. So 4 careful mystics. So you need to create a system that allows you to close doors. You don't need the other elements. But the other elements, if they do not exist, the column becomes just a technocratic device. We don't want that. We want the column to be a piece of our work, to be some sort of totem that we designed. So this was very important, and this is the final profile. And this profile was cast in situ, so it was necessary to produce a specific mold to be able to cast it. It was cast in full because concrete is cast from the top down, so we had to cast a full column, and after it was dry, to cut its feet. And this is how it felt like at the end. So this is a column that gravitates about 45 centimeters above the floor, which is very practical for cats, which is very practical, you know, if you want to swipe the floor, if you have one of those automatic vacuum cleaners, it's fantastic. But more than being practical, it's extremely symbolical. So when you lower yourself to the point where you see the wall behind it, you understand it's flying. And if for any reason you decide to put your head against the floor and to look at it, it really is flying. But 99% of the time, you almost don't perceive it as such. It's a very important device, a little bit like the house that Anna showed. It helps organizing a space. But in this case, this is a project that is all about this column. The other column belonged to a system. This project is the column in a way. So the house is just an excuse for the column to exist. And when you remove the column, you end up with this. You end up with this kind of compositions. You know, there's a pavement, a ceiling, a curve, a piece of mirror. You have the background. This is background, and the column is the, let's say, the main dish. And these are how the other rooms feel like. So they are just the relation between cabinets and probably one day a bed, a table, a user. And it's quite funny to see how the column is always there. It's always just, you know, like looking at you from the corner. This is it. And the column is the center of a system, but the system is not just a column, of course, because the house has more to it. And The facades are very important also because they define what we could call the masks that relate to the city, both to the urban scape, so to the cityscape, to the street, to the place that everyone can see, but also to the garden and to this kind of no man's land that is the view. So you can see the view, but the view cannot see you that much. And there's this relation. So when the house ends and the garden starts, but also the complete opposite when you see from the outside a reflection of the garden in the house, and how if you, again, are a weird person and decide to just look very, very high in the sky, the house relates to you. But if for some reason you decide to spend a few hours trying to frame the perfect frontal perspective of this house, something that I believe no one else will ever do in time. But if you do it, this is how it is perceived. It's just a very simple frame of what we could call modernist windows, just enough wall to save some money on the size of the windows, a drain pipe that is very proud, the shading that is necessary but in the right colors, and then a fronton that gives it an ending, and a dot that gives an ending to the ending. And unfortunately the house is just 2 levels above ground, but if it could be 50 levels or 60 levels, it would be much better. But the client only needed 4 rooms above, so that was all. But now that we did this small photo montage, it's really sad that we are not allowed to do, more with it. And this is it. So the house is just a system of 2 masks sustained or suspended on a column.
Yes, and after this, we've been continuing to design houses mostly, but also other things. But let's say we wanted perhaps to show a few things that are currently on the table at different stages of development, but that are, let's say, what excites us these days mostly. We call this pleasure principle. It's, in a way, I think it's about accepting the joys of playing with form. And we believe it's actually fundamental within, let's say, making architecture bearable, both on the interior and on the urban expression of the houses. So these are the kind of images we do every day in the offices, but they're really usually not meant to be shown. Actually, we find them quite disgusting as visual objects, but they are just meant for us to look at the houses continuously and to make iterations. This is a single family house we have worked on for a while, where the 2 different types of roof actually relate to the 2 generations of the family in some ways. Here, a different kind of game where the conditions of the slope of the site pushed us into experimenting this weird truncated shape. Another kind of truncated shape that, let's say, has perhaps more accidents that we are starting to build, hopefully very soon. And here, this one is actually 5 small houses for the children of a family in Lisbon on a very difficult site. And and this is one house we are going to finish soonish, hopefully. That, let's say, the shape is also informed by the site in to a large extent, but also, let's say, the 2 different antagonistic sides of the house, because it's a house made of 2 lines essentially, correspond to the interior organization. So the 2 sides of the living room, the one that follows the cut of the side, the other one that organizes the bedroom. I mean, here we can perhaps start to begin to understand this relationship between the house as an organism and the house as form. And this is the same kind of drawings for the 5 houses I was explaining before, where here again, actually those forms correspond to the typology and the organization of these houses, where each vault corresponds to a living room, each sloped roof corresponds to a service space. And what we liked about it is, I mean, from the interior, it just feels like grand spaces. From the exterior, it starts as a conglomerate to function, to find a certain kind of charisma. And we liked very much the idea that in the end, you have 2 volumes but they are made of the same rules, but they are very different. And one looks in a way like a black rabbit with white ears, and the other one has a face of a white cat with a black face, something like that. That's a bit part of the pleasure we find in these. And well, this idea of pleasure principle was theorized by a very boring guy actually the date is wrong. It should be 1.5 centuries before that. But we thought it was more interesting to look at Janet Jackson's definition of the pleasure principle. And we really like the rhyme in these 2 sentences because we thought got to go rhymes perfectly well with OOO. And in a way, let's say, we like the idea that the pleasure principle is also about escapism to a certain extent. But at the same time, let's say each house that we build, as Philip developed, relates to a context, to a certain place, to certain things that were demolished also. As Kojitaki wrote, houses live and die. And every time we build something, we also demolish something, and perhaps we find new relationships between what is new and what is left of the old. And as Philip explained again, this is a lot about trying to find a certain kind of vitality, right? If houses live and die, it's their life that matters to us, perhaps. And this vitality is one of the things that the projects are aiming for and trying to express. So if a house is a work of art, perhaps for us it's also a certain kind of promise for pleasure, of pleasure, even if that promise, it's still just a promise, of course. So that's
it.
That's it for us. Thank you very much. And we are happy to answer to questions if there are any.
Yes, thank you for your wonderful presentation and for walking us through some of your projects. So just a reminder for any participant who would like to ask a question, you can either write it down in the chat or write down your name if you wish to ask your question yourself. But I guess we can start off with one of our questions that we have for you. So we'd be curious to know, has your process ever betrayed you or caused you to question it? Is your process the same from house to house, or has it evolved over time?
Well, it evolved.
It has evolved. Yeah.
It has. I think before we were trying to be too serious, to be honest. I think with time we learn how to have a bit more fun, or explore a few more things.
I think it's more that we learned to accept that fun was actually one of the objectives, and that it was.
Yeah, I think it also came with a face with reality when you actually start building things, and
you want to prove yourself.
Yes, but not only we have. We don't have the most amazing budgets. We don't have the most amazing sites. Sometimes we have very nice clients. Sometimes not so much. And our work is to deal with all of that. And the seriousness that we had in the beginning, the projects, I think it slowly started to shift into seriousness during construction and more fun in the projects, I would say.
Yeah, and I think the process is not it's not something that is closed on itself, so it can evolve. It has evolved because the questions have evolved. So the briefs, the clients, all of these problems changed. Let's say the array of references has changed, and we have changed. And if we are involved with it, naturally things will also change. But I think it's a necessary change also, and that's why we decided also to show what are we interested in now as a kind of short conclusion, because it's important to say that you notice some tropes. There are some themes that run through most of the project, but there's also now a new opportunity. So we moved away from the city centers, mostly to the suburbs. So we are building buildings from scratch, buildings that had no form. So instead of masks, we are operating with form. And this idea of form led us to this nasty 3D renders. And probably if one day we move from the, let's say, residential domain to the public domain, it is possible that things will also change drastically. We can only speculate on that.
Great, thank you for your answer.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I'll just start reading some of these questions coming in. Very impressed with your projects. I have a question about the columns. Isn't it possible to combine the structural column with the architectural one, or don't you want to do that on purpose?
I mean, I think the perfect analogy for this is to eat to have nutrition or to eat for pleasure. I think that a column can be both, and in many cases it is, but usually don't talk about it. But to completely answer that question, the column should be architecture long before being structure. So if you need it, or long before being engineering in that sense. So if you need a column to operate as a device to fight gravity, to hold something on top of it, that's not a problem at all. But if you do a column that does not have that need, so if it does not need to give nutrition to the structure, then it becomes a pure object, and that interests us a lot.
In a way, the two projects that we have shown that have non-structural columns are experiments in...
We actually showed 3 with non-structural columns.
True. But the first one is, I would call it a post rather than a column almost. I think there are experiments in trying to separate these things and to look at them separately. But if you want an example of a project that does both, it's extremely simple. It's the Shinohara one. We have shown the house in white, where that central column is the structure of the house and is also very much and firstly a symbolical element. So I mean, of course it's possible, and it's most often the case.
But there's very technical reasons for why in our projects they are not. For example, the last project Filipe showed, we don't need at all in a 6 meter or 5 meters wide building a span. Sorry. So in that project we have, we don't need at all more structure than what we have. On the first project I showed, again, 5-6 meter span, we don't need it. On the House of Three Generations, the square one that I presented also, in that one, the real column that we have, it's quite massive, which would kill a bit this idea of the minimum element to subdivide a space. And then it couldn't be where we wanted it to be. Because then to actually hold the roof, it had to be in another location. So
we separated the two yes. parts of the egg. There's one that is just holding the building, and there's one that is just holding the architectural discourse.
Exactly.
Great, thank you for the question. I have a question here from Roberto Damiani. So how do you see your work in relation to Portuguese modernism?
Portuguese, I mean, well,
which modernism? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, well, I suppose, let's say, to extend the question to the Porto school and Portuguese architecture of the 20th century in general, it's one of the things, it's one of the architectures we look at a lot, but it's only one of them, and
but not necessarily the modernism, maybe the post-modernism. The thing is, I mean, we were in a dictatorship during the full time the rest of the world was in modernism times.
There was no
so we
modernism.
Never really got
very little true modernism.
We got what we call like soft Portuguese. That it was the soft modernism in Portuguese version.
We took the best of it at a season. That's it. We love season. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, but
everything else is very boring.
Let's put it like this: we refuse to be to do architecture that belongs only to one genealogy, and I mean that's something we would be very bored in doing. And
and also we don't deny with our Portuguese references and our Portuguese architecture. It just, especially now, it's not just that.
Also because our architecture office is quite diverse in the people that inhabit it, and so we also worked in different countries, and we have a lot of influences that let's say inform our architecture as much as.
And I think it's important to say. It's important to say that we are based in Portugal and we operate in Portugal and we build in Portugal. This has, it's undeniable. But today we made a presentation where we try to shift the lens to this relation between this Japanese ambition from a very specific period to a very banal context in which we operate. And I believe that if we were to build in Toronto, for example, the ambition would go with us, just the context would change. So let's say the context is not defining our architecture, although our architecture is in a way responding to a context.
And there's a follow-up question which perhaps clarifies the first question, which is, would you define César as a postmodernist? Obviously, yes. Right.
The best of the postmoderns.
I mean, his work is full of weird quotations and I mean, of course, being postmodernist in his case does not mean refusing modernism. It's a bit more complex than that.
Thank you. Also, Philip, your metaphors are always so appreciated. So great. Vivian had a question. Many of the design precedents in your own design projects are very elegant and compositionally based. Is there a methodical process by which you judge these compositions, color and pattern choices? And more importantly, how do you teach this?
So those are two questions.
So the teaching part, maybe I think the beginning of the presentation of Ahmed is it was a good example. It's like you learn by looking at many examples and why they did it and how they did it, and hopefully you manage to learn from it, of course.
I think more important than the what you design is the why you design it. And we are very much interested in, I mean, Raul, Alexia, Miska, so our students know this. We spent a full semester asking or trying to understand why certain architects did certain things. And I think that it's a contemporary problem, this problem of the image and the approach to the architecture from the image perspective. But if you remove that and you look at it from a more textual perspective, so why did this person did what he did? What was he trying to achieve with it? I think from that perspective, we are not that far away from the names we talked about before. And I think all of them were very much, let's say, worried about this specific perspective. The worst is the opposite, when you do something that is trying to look good without understanding what you're trying to do. And that's what we try to avoid as much as possible, both in our design practice, but also in our teaching practice.
Yeah, and perhaps to relate the two questions, one of the strategies we put in place for this teaching at the University of Daniels, the University of Toronto, was that instead of giving to the students, let's say, a small amount of building and to them, this is the stuff, we gave them a huge amount of buildings to look at, and we let them choose within this. So, I mean, of course, our role was to define a certain territory, but that territory was made of hundreds of houses, actually. And within these hundreds of houses, let's say, they chose the ones they wanted to talk about and the ones that mattered for them. So I think that's a bit where we try to make them take over, at least in part, the decoration that is part of then building projects.
Thank you for your answer. I'm just being mindful of time. It's already 2, so if possible, I'll ask one more question from the chat. So, question from Jihi Kim. I feel like a party pooper for saying this, but with pleasure and escapism, there is a side of seriousness and responsibility we may overlook. I really admire the playful outlook and challenge to architecture, but also curious to know how to reconcile the imminent challenges or responsibilities of environmental and or political issues that all architects should work with?
So we believe you don't have to choose. So and let's say we talk to you about what we enjoy showing you, but it doesn't mean that the rest does not exist, or that, I mean, so it's not, I don't think these things are mutually exclusive.
And also,
that's the short answer.
Yes,
I can give a shorter one. We don't care about those topics, period.
But
I think architecture comes from architecture. It is within the books, the names, the references we look at. And in our practice, as a practice, so individually, we might have many interests, but as a practice, we do not tackle neither environmental questions nor political questions. I think this is the most honest we can be.
Yes, but at the same time, for example, I think because we want to build so much and we want to make our projects happen or bring architectural to the common people, almost all of our clients actually would never work with an architect or with us. So there's 95, maybe more, 99% of world's construction that doesn't really involve architecture or architects. And we are currently working with that percentage of the world market, in this case just in Portugal. So the fact that we accept commissions that no one else would accept, that they are not amazing, but in the end we manage to actually do good architecture, and we see how our clients start to love architecture, start to enjoy what we do, start to be interested in other similar topics. It's also an educational process with them, but it's actually bringing good architecture, in our perspective, of course, to the classes of society that wouldn't have it or would have.
They did not know they could have it.
Yes,
they never wanted it.
But
it's an architecture that was not asked for. That's the whole.
But it's not. But it's not like it's only a gift in a way. And I think so. Yes, it's not central in our thinking. Of course, there are, these are also constraints that exist within the architecture and that we take in account. Like, it's not like we do not ignore, but we don't make it central, of course.
I think they are within the same realm as electrical projects and solar panels. We need to tackle those, but our architecture doesn't start from there.
Yeah, I think that's
maybe the structure.
Or the structure. We have to solve it. We have to solve it and
or
take it out of
the structural column.
I think that was a very full answer.
Did you notice that we don't agree with each other?
Yeah, I was.
No, but I think but ultimately we agree on the projects, but. I think
it's just things are not black and white, and I actually think that our office works quite well because we don't agree with each other, so we manage to tackle a lot of things. But of course, for us, the final goal is good architecture for the world. That would be the.
I think that's a really strong note to end on. I think we can talk forever and ask a million questions, but I just want to say thank you to our illustrious speakers and everybody here for joining us at Methodic Optimism.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
It was a pleasure.
And of course, thank you again and for always being generous with your time, and to everyone in attendance. And just kind of as a last note before we have to say goodbye, but the Daniels faculty has asked us to share information on some of its upcoming events. Specifically, Drew Adams will be speaking this Monday, February 8th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time as part of the Alumni Speaker Series. And the following day, Tuesday, February 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, the Architecture of Point William, a Laboratory for Living book launch will be taking place as part of the Daniels Talk series. And then to register or find more details, go to the Daniels website. And I cut you off and I'm so sorry. I just realized that now, but I was nervous. So And with that, I guess we hope to see you online again soon, and we really hope that everyone has a great day.
And hopefully not online soon also.
Yeah.